The year was 1853, a time when the western frontier promised both dreams and nightmares in equal measure. For those brave enough to traverse its vast, unforgiving landscapes, the promise of a new beginning could vanish in an instant, replaced by unimaginable horror. This is the story of Elizabeth Hargrove, who watched as everything she knew was destroyed before her eyes, and the man who found her when she had nothing left but the will to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blood on Elizabeth Hargrove's hands had dried to a rusty brown, cracking in the lines of her palms as she stumbled through the tall prairie grass. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson that reminded her too much of what she was desperately trying to escape. 3 days had passed since the attack. 3 days since she had crawled beneath the overturned wagon and pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle her screams as the sounds of death surrounded her. 3 days after the Whitaker wagon train, 23 settlers bound for Oregon territory had been ambushed in the pre-dawn hours by men whose faces she never clearly saw. Elizabeth had been gathering kindling when the first shots rang out. The crack of rifles split the quiet dawn, followed by screams that would haunt her for however many days she had left to live. She had dropped to the ground instantly, crawling through dew-soaked grass away from camp, but not far enough to avoid witnessing the slaughter. Now she was alone on the Dakota plains, a place where the sky stretched endlessly in all directions, making her feel smaller with each passing hour. Her dark brown hair hung in matted strands around her face, once pinned neatly but now wild and tangled. Her blue calico dress was torn at the hem, stained with dirt and blood, some hers, some not. The October wind cut through her clothing like a knife. Winter came early to these territories, and Elizabeth knew that if the lack of food didn't kill her, the cold surely would. Her stomach had long since stopped growling, moving past hunger to a hollow emptiness that made her limbs feel disconnected. And from her body, she had taken what she could from the massacre site after the attackers left: a canteen half full of water, a small knife with a bone handle that had belonged to Mr. Simmons, the wagon master, and a woolen shawl that had fallen from one of the wagons. Nothing else was salvageable or worth the risk of lingering. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from disuse and thirst. Just keep moving. But moving toward what? Elizabeth had no clear destination, only the vague understanding that she needed to find a settlement, a trading post, any sign of civilization. The wagon train had been following the North Platte River, aiming to reach Fort Laramie before the worst of winter set in. But in her panic and confusion after the attack, she'd lost track of the river. Each step was becoming more difficult than the last. Her boots, never meant for such a journey, had rubbed raw blisters on her heels that burst and bled anew with every step. The knife she carried offered little comfort against the vastness of the wilderness or the threats it contained. As night approached, Elizabeth sought shelter in a shallow ravine, gathering what dry grasses she could find to create some meager protection against the wind. She had no means to start a fire. The flint had been in her husband's pocket, and Robert's body lay back at the massacre site, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Robert Hargrove had been a banker's son from Pennsylvania, full of ambition and dreams of building a new life in Oregon. Their marriage had been one of convenience more than passion. His family needed her family's modest connections, and her family needed his wealth. But over 3 years together, they had developed a quiet fondness for one another. Enough that, when he proposed heading west, she had agreed without hesitation. Now she was alone, a widow at 24, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a crushing weight of memories she couldn't bear to examine too closely. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the distant howl of wolves and the constant gnawing fear that kept her heart racing. When dawn broke, Elizabeth forced herself to her feet despite the protests of her aching body. The morning was grey, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that threatened rain. She drained the last drops from her canteen, allowing herself a moment of despair before steeling her resolve. Her father had always said she had a stubborn streak wider than the Mississippi. It was time to prove him right. By midday, the clouds had opened, releasing a steady, cold rain that soaked through her clothing and chilled her to the bone. Elizabeth's pace slowed, her boots sliding in the mud, each step requiring more effort than she could afford to give. Still, she pushed forward, following a gradual downward slope in hopes it would lead to water. It was during a brief respite from the rain that she spotted it. A thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the grey sky. Her heart leaped into her throat. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant either salvation or danger. Elizabeth hesitated, debating whether to approach or avoid the smoke. Who might be waiting there? Settlers, soldiers, the very men who had attacked her wagon train. Desperation won out over caution. She would die out here alone. That much was certain. Whatever waited for that fire couldn't be worse than freezing. To death or starving in this vast emptiness, she altered her course, heading toward the smoke with renewed purpose. The rain began again, harder now, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on that distant promise of life. What she didn't notice were the eyes watching her. From a ridge nearly half a mile away, a solitary figure tracked her movement through the rain-swept landscape. He had been following her trail for nearly a day, reading the story of her desperate flight in the bent grasses and dragging footprints she left behind. Massacre, known to the white settlers as Swift Fox, lowered his spyglass and frowned. The woman was heading straight for a camp of fur trappers, men whose reputation for cruelty toward both natives and women was well known among his people. She was walking from one death into another. He folded the brass spyglass, a prized possession, traded years ago for 6 prime beaver pelts, and slid it into the leather pouch at his side. Rain dripped from the brim of the wide-brimmed hat he wore, a concession to the weather rather than any desire to adopt white man's fashion. Massacre was Dakota of the Wagon band, though he had spent much of the past decade moving between worlds, hunting, trading, occasionally serving as guide or interpreter when it suited his purposes. He had been tracking a small herd of elk when he discovered the massacre site 2 days earlier. The brutality of the attack had told him immediately it wasn't the work of his people or any other tribe he knew. The bodies had been stripped of valuables, but left otherwise intact. No tribal warrior would waste such resources. This was the work of white men, preying on their own kind, bandits using the convenient excuse of Indian attacks to cover their crimes. He had found her trail leading away. From the site, small footprints, uneven, clearly exhausted and frightened. Following her hadn't been a conscious decision, merely an extension of his curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Now, watching her stumble toward danger, Massacre knew he had a choice to make. Leave her to her fate. After all, she was not his responsibility, not his people, or intervene in ways that could bring him only trouble. The rain continued to fall, washing away any easy answers, leaving only the hard truth that the woman wouldn't survive another night alone on the plains. Massacre stood, adjusted the rifle slung across his back, and began to move. Whatever decision he had just made, even he wasn't entirely sure of his reasons. But as the distance between them closed, he knew that both their fates had just become entangled in ways neither could yet understand. Elizabeth's vision blurred as she pushed forward. Through the tall grass, the distant smoke her only beacon in the gathering dusk. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Her clothes clung to her skin, drawing precious warmth from her body with every gust of wind. The small knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance, but she gripped it tighter as she approached what appeared to be a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixing with another scent that made her empty stomach clench: roasting meat. She paused at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of scrub oak. Through the branches she could make out 3 wagons arranged in a rough semicircle. 5 men moved about the camp, rough-looking figures in buckskin and wool. A campfire blazed in the center, where something small, perhaps a rabbit, turned on a crude spit. Elizabeth hesitated, doubt, creeping in where desperation had led. There was something about these men that set off warnings in her mind. Their loud, coarse laughter carried to her hiding spot, along with fragments of conversation that made her skin crawl. Good haul from them wagons. Should have kept one. Of them women. Next time we won't be so hasty. The blood in Elizabeth's veins turned to ice. These weren't potential saviors. These were the men who had murdered the Whitaker party, her friends, her husband. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound, when her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, catching herself, against a tree trunk, but not before dislodging a cascade of raindrops from the leaves above. One of the men turned toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp with suspicion. "Show yourself!" Elizabeth froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The man started toward her hiding spot, joined by another who carried a rifle. She knew she should run, but her body refused to obey, trapped between fear and exhaustion. "Check it out, Jenkins," the second man ordered. "Probably just a deer, but no sense taking chances." The man called Jenkins drew his pistol and advanced toward the tree line where Elizabeth hid. In 20 more steps, he would discover her. 30. She would be dead. Or worse. A sharp whistling sound cut through the air, followed by a dull thud. Jenkins stopped abruptly, looking down at his chest in confusion. The shaft of an arrow protruded from between his ribs, its fletching, trembling with the impact. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood emerged, spilling down his chin before he crumpled to the ground. Pandemonium erupted in the camp. The remaining men scattered for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting conflicting orders. Another arrow flew from somewhere to Elizabeth's left, missing its target but sending the bandits into further disarray. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Indians!" one of them yelled. "Take cover!" Elizabeth remained motionless, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The bandits' attention was no longer on finding her, but on the new threat. She needed to move, to escape while they were distracted. But which way was safe? A strong hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. An arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward into the deeper shadows beyond the scrub oak. "Be still," a voice whispered in her ear, the English, heavily accented but clear. "Or we both die." Elizabeth's instinct was to struggle, to fight against this new captor, but the sound of gunfire from the camp made her reconsider. Whoever held her had just killed one of the men responsible for the massacre. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not an enemy. She allowed herself to be pulled deeper into the woods, moving in a low crouch behind her mysterious rescuer. Only when they were several hundred yards from the camp did he release his hold on her. Elizabeth spun around, knife raised defensively, and got her first clear look at the man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat that seemed oddly out of place with his otherwise traditional appearance. A bow was slung across his back, alongside a rifle of European make. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Dark, intelligent, and currently regarding her with a mixture of wariness and assessment. "They kill your people," he stated rather than ask, "at Wagon Place 3 suns ago." Elizabeth nodded slowly, not lowering her knife. "Yes. How did you—" "Found dead. Saw your tracks." He gestured in the direction they had come. "Those men, bad men. Not my people who attacked your wagons." "I know," Elizabeth whispered, the knife wavering in her grip as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "I heard them talking." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Cannot stay here. They will search when they find courage again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out from the direction of the camp, followed by shouting. The bandits were regrouping, perhaps preparing to hunt down whoever had attacked them. "I'm Elizabeth," she said, lowering the knife finally. What choice did she have but to trust this stranger? "Elizabeth Hargrove," the man touched his chest. "Maca." Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call Maca Swift Fox." "Thank you for—" Elizabeth began, but her words died as her legs finally gave way beneath her. She crumpled toward the ground, the world spinning around her. Maca moved with surprising speed, catching her before she could fall completely. "Too long without food, without rest," he observed, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "Need a safe place." Despite her situation, despite everything, Elizabeth felt a flicker of fear as this stranger, this native warrior, lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. But she lacked the strength to protest, and somewhere in her mind, a voice whispered that if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. Maca carried her deeper into the woods, moving with a silent grace that seemed impossible for someone bearing her weight. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them as darkness settled completely over the land. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, awareness coming in fragments. The steady rhythm of Maca's breathing, the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet, the stars appearing one by one through gaps in the canopy above. When she next opened her eyes fully, they were in a small ravine, sheltered by an overhanging rock formation. A tiny fire burned, carefully banked to produce minimal smoke. The warmth it radiated was the first real comfort Elizabeth had felt in days. Maca knelt beside her, offering a water skin. "Drink. Slow." She accepted it with trembling hands, taking careful sips of the cool water. Each swallow felt like life, itself flowing back into her parched body. "Why?" she asked when she had drunk her fill. "Why help me?" Maca sat back on his heels, considering her question with the same grave intensity he seemed to apply to everything. In the flickering firelight, she could see details she had missed before. A scar that ran along his jawline, the intricate beadwork on the medicine pouch that hung at his belt, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much. "Many reasons," he answered finally. "None simple." He reached into a leather bag and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. "Eat, sleep. Tomorrow words will come easier." Elizabeth accepted the food, tearing off small pieces with her teeth as she'd seen the men of the wagon train do with their jerky. The flavor was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, gamey and smoky. As she ate, Maca moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning himself where he could watch for any sign of pursuit. His profile against the night sky seemed as much a part of this wild landscape as the trees and rocks that surrounded them. Elizabeth finished the meat and leaned back against the stone wall behind her, wondering at the strange turn her fate had taken. 3 days ago, she was Elizabeth Hargrove, banker's wife, heading toward a new life in Oregon territory. Now she was a widow, a survivor, dependent on the mercy of a man from a world as foreign to her as the moon. Sleep tugged at her, heavier with each passing moment. As her eyes drifted closed, her last thought was of how quickly everything could change, how thin the line between life and death, between enemy and ally, between past and future. In her dreams, the massacre played out again and again. But this time, a figure watched from the shadows, a man with dark eyes and a wide-brimmed hat, witnessing her survival with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Elizabeth's vision blurred as she pushed forward through the tall grass, the distant, smoke her only beacon in the gathering dusk. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Her clothes clung to her skin, drawing precious warmth from her body with every gust of wind. The small knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance, but she gripped it tighter as she approached what appeared to be a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixing with another scent that made her empty stomach clench: roasting meat. She paused at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of scrub oak. Through the branches, she could make out 3 wagons arranged in a rough semicircle. 5 men moved about the camp, rough-looking figures in buckskin and wool. A campfire blazed in the center, where something small, perhaps a rabbit, turned on a crude spit. Elizabeth hesitated, doughty, creeping in where desperation had led. There was something about these men that set off warnings in her mind. Their loud, coarse laughter carried to her hiding spot, along with fragments of conversation that made her skin crawl. Good haul from them wagons. Shoulda kept one. Of them women, next time we won't be so hasty. The blood in Elizabeth's veins turned to ice. These weren't potential saviors. These were the men who had murdered the Whittaker party, her friends, her husband. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound, when her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, catching herself, against a tree trunk, but not before dislodging a cascade of raindrops from the leaves above. One of the men turned toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp with suspicion. "Show yourself." Elizabeth froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The man started toward her hiding spot, joined by another who carried a rifle. She knew she should run, but her body refused to obey, trapped between fear and exhaustion. "Check it out, Jenkins," the second man ordered. "Probably just a deer, but no sense taking chances." The man called Jenkins drew his pistol and advanced toward the tree line where Elizabeth hid. In 20 more steps, he would discover her. In 30, she would be dead, or worse. A sharp whistling sound cut through the air, followed by a dull thud. Jenkins stopped abruptly, looking down at his chest in confusion. The shaft of an arrow protruded from between his ribs, its fletching. Trembling with the impact, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood emerged, spilling down his chin before he crumpled to the ground. Pandemonium erupted in the camp. The remaining men scattered for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting conflicting orders. Another arrow flew from somewhere to Elizabeth's left, missing its target, but sending the bandits into further disarray. "Indians!" one of them yelled. "Take cover!" Elizabeth remained motionless, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The bandits' attention was no longer on finding her, but on the new threat. She needed to move, to escape while they were distracted. But which way was safe? A strong hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. An arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward into the deeper shadows beyond the scrub oak. "Be still," a voice whispered in her ear, the English heavily accented but clear. "Or we both die." Elizabeth's instinct was to struggle, to fight against this new captor, but the sound of gunfire from the camp made her reconsider. Whoever held her had just killed one of the men responsible for the massacre. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not an enemy. She allowed herself to be pulled deeper into the woods, moving in a low crouch behind her mysterious rescuer. Only when they were several hundred yards from the camp did he release his hold on her. Elizabeth spun around, knife raised, defensively, and got her first clear look at the man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat that seemed oddly out of place with his otherwise traditional appearance. A bow was slung across his back, alongside a rifle of European make, but it was his eyes that held her attention, dark, intelligent, and currently regarding her with a mixture of wariness and assessment. "They kill your people," he stated rather than ask. "At Wagon Place, 3 suns ago." Elizabeth nodded slowly, not lowering her knife. "Yes. How did you—" "Found dead. Saw your tracks." He gestured in the direction they had come. "Those men, bad men, not my people who attacked your wagons." "I know," Elizabeth whispered, the knife wavering in her grip as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "I heard them talking." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Cannot stay here. They will search when they find courage again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out from the direction of the camp, followed by shouting. The bandits were regrouping, perhaps preparing to hunt down whoever had attacked them. "I'm Elizabeth," she said, lowering the knife finally. What choice did she have but to trust this stranger? "Elizabeth Hargrove." The man touched his chest. "Macha." Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call Macha Swift Fox." "Thank you for—" Elizabeth began, but her words died as her legs finally gave way beneath her. She crumpled toward the ground, the world spinning around her. Macha moved with surprising speed, catching her before she could fall completely. "Too long without food, without rest," he observed, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "Need a safe place." Despite her situation, despite everything, Elizabeth felt a flicker of fear as this stranger, this native warrior, lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. But she lacked the strength to protest. And somewhere in her mind, a voice whispered that if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. Macha carried her deeper into the woods, moving with a silent grace that seemed impossible for someone bearing her weight. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, as darkness settled completely over the land. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, awareness coming in fragments, the steady rhythm of Macha's breathing, the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet, the stars appearing one by one through gaps in the canopy above. When she next opened her eyes fully, they were in a small ravine, sheltered by an overhanging rock formation. A tiny fire burned, carefully banked to produce minimal smoke. The warmth it radiated was the first real comfort Elizabeth had felt in days. Macha knelt beside her, offering a water skin. "Drink, slow." She accepted it with trembling hands, taking careful sips of the cool water. Each swallow felt like life, itself flowing back into her parched body. "Why?" she asked when she had drunk her fill. "Why help me?" Macha sat back on his heels, considering her question with the same grave intensity he seemed to apply to everything. In the flickering firelight, she could see details she had missed before. A scar that ran along his jawline, the intricate beadwork on the medicine pouch that hung at his belt, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much. "Many reasons," he answered finally. "None simple." He reached into a leather bag and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. "Eat, sleep. Tomorrow, words will come easier." Elizabeth accepted the food, tearing off small pieces with her teeth, as she'd seen the men of the wagon train do with their jerky. The flavor was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, gamey and smoky. As she ate, Macha moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning himself where he could watch for any sign of pursuit. His profile against the night sky seemed as much a part of this wild landscape as the trees and rocks that surrounded them. Elizabeth finished the meat and leaned back against the stone wall behind her, wondering at the strange turn her fate had taken. 3 days ago, she was Elizabeth Hargrove, banker's wife, heading toward a new life in Oregon Territory. Now she was a widow, a survivor, dependent on the mercy of a man from a world as foreign to her as the moon. Sleep tugged at her, heavier with each passing moment. As her eyes drifted closed, her last thought was of how quickly everything could change, how thin the line between life and death, between enemy and ally, between past and future. In her dreams, the massacre played out again and again, but this time a figure watched from the shadows, a man with dark eyes and a wide-brimmed hat, witnessing her survival with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Dawn broke with a cold clarity that painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold. Elizabeth woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the rock shelter around her and the small fire that had burned down to glowing embers. Memory flooded back in a rush. The bandits, the arrow, the man called Massacre, who had carried her to safety. She sat up slowly, muscles protesting after days of exertion and poor rest. Her clothes had dried overnight, stiff with dirt and other stains she preferred not to examine too closely. A quick assessment of her surroundings revealed that she was alone. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had Massacre abandoned her? She reached instinctively for the knife, finding it placed carefully beside the water skin within easy reach. "You sleep." "Like dead," came a voice from the entrance of the small shelter. Massacre ducked inside, carrying a handful of small, brownish roots. "Good. Body needs healing." Relief washed over Elizabeth, followed immediately by embarrassment at her reaction. "I thought that swift fox leaves you?" A hint of what might have been amusement touched his eyes. "No. Went to find food, check for bad men." He knelt by, the fire adding small twigs to coax the embers back to life. They search still, but go in the wrong direction, south. Elizabeth watched as he set the roots near the growing flames. "What are those?" "Prairie turnip. Good food. Medicine too." He glanced at her torn dress and the visible scratches on her arms. "Will help healing." While the roots cooked, Massacre produced a small clay pot from his pack and mixed water with some kind of dried herb. The resulting paste he offered to Elizabeth, along with a questioning look. She hesitated only briefly before extending her arm, revealing a deep cut just below her elbow that had begun to show angry red lines extending from it. Massacre nodded grimly and began applying the paste with surprisingly gentle fingers. "Infection starts," he explained. "This will fight, but I need more. Have medicine at my camp." He finished treating her wound and sat back. "Can you walk today?" Elizabeth flexed her feet, assessing the pain in her blistered heels. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. He studied her face. "For you, maybe 4. The implied challenge in his words sparked something in Elizabeth. A stubborn pride she had nearly forgotten during her days of desperate flight. "I can keep up." The hint of a smile ghosted across Macca's face. "We see." They ate the prairie turnips along with the last of Macca's dried meat. The food, simple as it was, restored some of Elizabeth's strength, though she knew it would take more than one meal to recover from her ordeal. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth found herself confronting a reality she had been too exhausted to fully consider the night before. She was placing her trust, her life, in the hands of a man whose people were often portrayed as savages in the stories told around settler campfires. Yet this savage had shown more humanity than the white men who had murdered her husband. "And friends, why did you help me?" she asked again as Massacre extinguished the fire with handfuls of dirt. The truth this time. He paused, regarding her with those unfathomable dark eyes. "Truth has many sides, like river stone." He seemed to debate with himself before continuing. I follow the tracks from the Wagon place. See, you are alone, hunted. Those men. His expression hardened. They kill my people too. Say Indians did it. Use fear of Dakota, Lakota to hide their crimes. Elizabeth frowned. You were tracking them? The bandits? Maka nodded once. For many moons. They raid, they kill, they blame my people. Then white soldiers come, punish innocent villages. He shouldered his pack. You are a witness. You saw the truth. Maybe one day you will speak this truth. The weight of his words settled over Elizabeth. She had never considered the consequences of the false attribution of attacks. How many innocent people on both sides had died because of such deceptions? I will, she promised, her voice strengthening with resolve. If I live to tell you about it. You live, Maka said with quiet certainty. Now we go. They traveled northwest, keeping to ravines and sparse woodland where possible to avoid being spotted. Maka set a pace that was challenging but not impossible, occasionally slowing when he noticed Elizabeth struggling. They spoke little. Conversation, limited to practical matters. Warnings about terrain, brief rests for water, instructions on which plants to avoid. By midday, Elizabeth's body had settled into the rhythm of the journey, the consistent movement actually easing some of the stiffness from her muscles. She found herself studying Maka as they walked, the efficient grace of his movements, the constant awareness he maintained of their surroundings, the way he blended European and native elements in his dress and tools. You speak English well, she observed during a brief rest beside a small creek. Better than you first showed. Maka gave her an appraising look, as if deciding how much to reveal. Lived at mission school, 3 winters. Learned white man's words, white man's God. He dipped his hand in the creek, letting the water flow through his fingers. Learned how white men think, useful knowledge. But you left, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. Mission wants Dakota to become white inside, forget old ways. He touched the medicine pouch at his belt. Some ways should not be forgotten. Elizabeth thought of her own education at the ladies' seminary in Philadelphia, where she had been taught that civilization was a gift being bestowed upon the savage races. Now, facing the reality of the frontier, she wondered which world was truly savage. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the prairie. Twice, Maka froze in mid-step, signaling for Elizabeth to be still. Each time, after long moments of listening, he would relax slightly and gesture for them to proceed. She never asked what he had heard or sensed. Some things were better left unknown. As dusk approached, they reached a series of low hills, dotted with juniper and pine. Maka led her to a sheltered hollow where a natural spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool before trickling away downstream. We rest here, he announced, shedding his pack. Good water, hidden. Elizabeth sank gratefully too, the ground, removing her boots to examine her feet. The blisters had broken and resealed several times during the day's journey, creating a painful patchwork of raw and calloused skin. She stifled a groan as she dipped her feet in the cool spring. Water? Maka watched her for a moment, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. He returned shortly with a handful of broad leaves and some white chalky stones. Crouching beside the spring, he crushed the stones to powder and mixed it with the masticated leaves to form a poultice. For feet, he explained, offering the mixture to her. Will draw pain, help skin grow strong. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before applying the poultice to her battered feet. The relief was almost immediate, a cooling sensation that dulled the throbbing pain. Thank you, she said, the words seeming inadequate for all he had done. You've been, she searched for the right word, kind. Maka looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Is survival. You help me, I help you. How have I helped? You? Elizabeth asked, genuinely puzzled. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally he turned back to her, his expression serious in the deepening twilight. White woman alone on a prairie has many enemies. White woman with the Dakota hunter has one more, but also has an ally who knows both worlds. He gestured to the vast landscape around them. This country bleeds from fighting between my people and yours. Maybe some must learn to walk between, to find a new path. The weight of his words settled over Elizabeth as the first stars appeared overhead. She had lost everything she knew, yet here in this hollow beside a spring, with a man from a world she had been taught to fear. She felt the first tentative stirring of something unexpected, not hope, it was too soon for that, but possibility, a future not yet written. As they prepared a small, smokeless fire for the night, Elizabeth found herself wondering what that future might hold and whether she would have the courage to walk the path that was unfolding before her, one step at a time. Morning arrived with a layer of frost that glittered on the grass surrounding their camp. Elizabeth woke to find Massacre already alert, watching the eastern horizon with a troubled expression. The poultice on her feet had dried overnight, forming a protective crust that cracked when she moved. Beneath it, her skin felt less raw, the worst of the blisters beginning to heal. "Storm coming," Massacre said, nodding toward a bank of dark clouds gathering in the distance. "Bad timing," Elizabeth followed his gaze, noting the ominous wall of grey approaching from the northwest. "How far is your camp?" "Still 2 days. Maybe more with storms." He handed her a small bundle of dried berries. "Eat. Need strength today." The berries were tart but nourishing, easing the hollow feeling in her stomach. As she ate, Elizabeth took stock of herself. The torn dress that hung loosely on her frame after days of little food, the tangled mess of her hair, the dirt embedded beneath her fingernails. She had never been particularly vain, but the physical transformation reflected a deeper change taking place within her. "Can I?" She gestured toward the spring, embarrassed but determined. "I need to wash." Massacre nodded, understanding immediately. "I will check the trail ahead. Return soon." He gathered his bow and slipped away through the trees, offering her privacy without needing to be asked. Elizabeth waited until he was out of sight, then stripped off her filthy dress and underclothes. The water was breathtakingly cold, but she forced herself to endure it, scrubbing at her skin and hair with handfuls of sand from the spring's edge. The simple act of washing away days of grime felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. She had just finished dressing when a sound caught her attention. A snapping twig, too heavy to be Massacre's careful footsteps. Elizabeth froze, her gaze darting to where her knife lay beside her discarded boots. A man emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the spring, bearded, wearing a buckskin jacket stained with grease and gunpowder. One of the bandits. His eyes widened when he saw her, surprise quickly replaced by a predatory smile. "Well now," he drawled, hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Didn't expect to find a lady taking a bath out here." His gaze traveled over her with open hunger. "You must be the one that got away from the wagons." Elizabeth's mind raced. Massacre was too far to hear a call for help. The knife was several steps away. The bandit had a gun. Her options were few and desperate. Jenkins was right, thought he heard something before that arrow took him. The man spat on the ground. "Where's your red-skinned friend, The one who's been leaving us little surprises?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Elizabeth said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm alone." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the rocks. "Sure you are, darling, and I'm the Queen of England." He stepped closer, circling the spring. "Tell you what, you tell me where he's hiding, and maybe I won't take you back to the boys. Maybe it's just you and me having a little fun instead, Elizabeth." Backed away, calculating distances. If she could reach the knife, if she could distract him somehow. "Don't be stupid now," the man warned, drawing his pistol. "Ain't nowhere to run out here." A distant rumble of thunder punctuated his words. The storm moving closer with unnatural speed. The man glanced briefly at the darkening sky, and in that moment of distraction, Elizabeth lunged for her knife. The bandit cursed, swinging his pistol toward her as her fingers closed around the handle. Time seemed to slow as she rolled to her feet, knife clutched before her, his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot never came. Instead, the man's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a silent cry. He staggered forward a step, revealing the arrow protruding from his back, then crumpled to the ground. Maka stepped from the shadows of the juniper trees, another arrow already knocked in his bow. His eyes met Elizabeth's over the fallen bandit, dark and unreadable. "You said you were checking the trail ahead," she managed, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. "Did." Maka lowered his bow. "Found signs, come back." He moved to the bandit's body, confirming what was already clear. "He is not alone, others nearby." Elizabeth stared at the dead man, her stomach churning. It wasn't the first death she had witnessed, not after the massacre, but the immediacy of it, the way life had fled his eyes in an instant, left her shaken. "We must go. Now." Maka gathered her boots, thrusting them into her hands. "Storm will hide our trail, but must move." "Vast." Elizabeth pulled on her boots, fingers fumbling with the laces. "How many others?" "3, maybe 4. Maka was already collecting their few belongings, movements efficient and urgent. They separate to hunt. This one found spring by luck. Bad luck for him, Elizabeth thought, then immediately felt guilty for the thought. The man had been prepared to kill her, or worse, but death was never something to be celebrated, no matter who it claimed. They left the hollow as the first fat raindrops began to fall, heading deeper into the hills where the trees grew thicker. The terrain became increasingly difficult, the ground rising in sharp inclines that left Elizabeth breathless. Maka set a punishing pace, glancing back occasionally to ensure she kept up. By midday, the storm had reached its full fury. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the ground to treacherous mud that sucked at their boots with each step. Thunder boomed overhead, the sound so close it seemed to vibrate through Elizabeth's very bones. "Need shelter!" Maka shouted over the roar of the storm. "This way!" He led her through a narrow gap between two rock formations and into a shallow cave, barely deep enough for both of them to sit out of the rain. Water streamed from their clothing, forming puddles on the stone floor. "Will they follow us in this?" Elizabeth asked, wringing water from her sodden skirts. Maka shook his head. "Not in a storm. Too dangerous. But after—" He left the implication hanging. They sat in silence for a time, watching the rain create a curtain across the cave entrance. Despite the danger, despite the cold and discomfort, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of calm. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, or perhaps something deeper, the acceptance that her old life was truly gone, replaced by this new reality where each moment was uncertain. "You fought," Maka said suddenly, breaking the silence. "In spring, I had a knife ready." Elizabeth glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "I wasn't going to just let him kill me." "Many would freeze. You did not." There was something like respect in his tone. "My father always said, fear is useful only if it makes you act," she replied. The memory came with unexpected clarity, her father teaching her to shoot his old fowling piece when she was 12, his patient instruction on how to overcome the natural flinch at the recoil. "Your father, he is a warrior?" Elizabeth almost laughed at the idea of Charles Hargrove, Philadelphia banker and Sunday school teacher, being described as a warrior. "No, he was a businessman, but he believed women should know how to protect themselves." Her smile faded. He died when I was 17. Fever. Maka nodded, accepting this piece of her history without comment. After a moment he reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather bundle. From it he produced a piece of pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries pounded into a dense cake. "Last food," he said, breaking it in half and offering her the larger portion. "Save strength." The storm continued for hours, alternating between violent downpours and periods of steady rain. They remained in the cave, speaking little, each lost in their own thoughts. Elizabeth found herself studying Maka's profile against the grey light from outside. The sharp line of his jaw, the slight hook of his nose, the single feather tied into his braid that moved gently with each breath. He was not what she had expected. None of this was what she had expected when she had agreed to join Robert on the journey west. Life had a way of veering from its intended course, like a river changing its path after a storm. "When rain stops," Maka said eventually, "we go north. Different way to my camp, safer. And if they find us before then?" His eyes met hers, steady and certain. "Then we fight. Together." The simple declaration settled over Elizabeth like a blanket, warming something that had grown cold inside her since the massacre. Not just the promise of protection, but the acknowledgement of partnership. We, not I. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling more distantly now. Soon they would need to move again, continuing this journey into the unknown. But for this moment, in this small cave with rain drumming a gentle rhythm against stone, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe that perhaps survival was not the only possibility left to her. Perhaps there was still room for something more. Storm passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Morning revealed a world washed clean, the hills glistening under a pale blue sky. Puddles dotted the ground, reflecting the clouds that drifted overhead like scattered thoughts. Elizabeth emerged from the cave, muscles stiff from the cramped quarters. She stretched cautiously, testing her body's limits. To her surprise, she felt stronger than the day before. The combination of rest, food, and Maka's medicinal treatments had begun to restore her. Maka was already surveying their surroundings, his gaze sweeping the hills with practiced precision. "Good," he said after a moment. "Rain hides our trail, but also—" He pointed to the softened earth near the cave entrance where clear footprints were visible. "Will show our new path." "Can we avoid leaving tracks?" Elizabeth asked, eyeing the muddy ground with concern. "Not completely, but it can be confusing." He gestured for her to follow, leading her to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a small valley. "See there, stream bigger now from rain. We follow in water when we can, cross often, make the trail hard to read." The strategy made sense. Elizabeth nodded, adding, "My father once told me that outlaws in the Carolinas would walk backward in their own footprints to fool trackers." Maka gave her an appraising look. "Your father teaches many useful things." They set off at a steady pace, angling northeast toward the swollen stream that cut through the valley. The going was difficult, the ground treacherous with mud that clung to their boots and made each step an effort. Twice Elizabeth nearly fell, saved only by Maka's quick hand at her elbow. When they reached the stream, Maka paused, studying the rushing water. "Current strong. You swim?" Elizabeth hesitated. "A little. In ponds, never in running water." He nodded, considering. "We cross together. Hold here." He indicated a spot on his pack strap. "Step where I step." The water was shockingly cold, the current more powerful than it had appeared from the bank. Elizabeth clutched Maka's pack, her knuckles white with effort as the water rose past her. Knees, then to her thighs. A misstep sent her staggering, but Maka's arm shot back, steadying her before she could be swept away. They emerged on the far bank, soaked but safe. Elizabeth's teeth chattered uncontrollably, her wet skirts clinging to her legs like a second skin. Maka frowned at her shivering form. Need dry clothes. Wet cloth steals warmth. He glanced at the sun's position. My camp is still far away. May have to make a fire. No, Elizabeth insisted through chattering teeth. Too dangerous. I'll dry as we walk. Maka studied her for a moment, then shrugged out of his buckskin jacket. Wear this. Wet, but still holds warmth. When she hesitated, he added, not a request. Necessity. The jacket was heavy on her shoulders, still damp from their crossing, but significantly warmer than her sodden dress. It smelled of wood smoke, pine and something else, a musky, earthy scent that was distinctly Maka. They continued along the stream for nearly an hour, crossing back and forth at Maka's direction, sometimes walking directly in the shallow parts. Of the water, Elizabeth soon understood his strategy. Anyone tracking them would find a confusing pattern of appearing and disappearing footprints, making it impossible to determine a clear direction. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to warm the air, and Elizabeth's clothes had begun to dry. Her spirits lifted with the temperature, a cautious optimism taking root. Perhaps they would reach Maka's camp safely after all. How did you learn to track so well? She asked during a brief rest. Is it something all your people know? Maka took a sip from his water skin before answering. All Dakota children learned to read signs, animal tracks, weather signs, movement in grass. But my father was a scout for many winters, taught me more. A shadow crossed his face. Taught me to read white men too. Your father, Elizabeth ventured carefully, noting his use of past tense. Is he dead? 3 winters passed. Maka's voice was flat, but his fingers tightened around the water skin. Soldiers came to village, said Dakota raid white settlement. Father tried to explain, show proof was not our people. His jaw tightened. They did not listen. Elizabeth felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. I'm sorry. Maka's dark eyes met hers. You did not hold a rifle. No, but my people did. She hesitated, then added, the same sort of men who attacked my wagon train. They've been causing this hatred, haven't they? Creating conflicts between your people and mine. Some men profit from fear, Maka replied. Fear makes walls between people. Walls hide truth. They walked in silence after that, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The landscape gradually changed, the hills giving way to a rolling prairie dotted with stands of cottonwood and willow. Maka grew more alert as they entered this more exposed terrain, his hand often resting on his knife or moving to the bow slung across his back. Late in the afternoon, they created a small rise, and Maka suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling for Elizabeth to do the same. He pointed to a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Fire, he whispered. Not my camp. Too soon. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. The bandits? Maybe. Or travelers, or... He frowned, studying the smoke pattern. Army patrol. Neither option was reassuring. If it was the bandits, the danger was obvious, but an army patrol might be equally threatening. To Maka if they held prejudices. Against natives, and possibly to Elizabeth as well if they didn't believe her account of the massacre. We go round, Maka decided. Wide circle, more walking but safer. The detour took them through a marshy area where the footing was uncertain and clouds of insects swarmed around their faces. Elizabeth swatted futilely at the buzzing pests. Trying to maintain her composure despite the discomfort, she would not complain, would not be a burden. Maka moved ahead, testing the ground with a stick to avoid the deeper mud patches. He had just helped Elizabeth across a particularly treacherous spot when he suddenly stiffened, his head turning sharply toward a clump of willows to their left. Elizabeth followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. What is it? Instead of answering, Maka slowly reached for his bow. notching an arrow with practiced ease. His eyes never left the willows, which now seemed to Elizabeth to be swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. A tense moment passed. Then the silence was shattered by a guttural growl as a massive shape burst from the willows. A grizzly bear, its fur dark with mud, eyes glinting with rage at the intrusion into its territory. Massacre lost his arrow, the shaft embedding itself in the bear's shoulder. The animal roared in pain but didn't slow, charging directly toward them with terrifying speed. "Run!" Massacre shouted, pushing Elizabeth toward higher ground as he nocked another arrow. Elizabeth stumbled backward, her boot catching in the mud. She fell hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Through dazed eyes, she saw Massacre standing his ground, firing a second arrow that found its mark in the bear's chest. Still, the bear came on, seemingly unstoppable in its fury. Massacre drew his knife, a pitiful weapon against such a monster, and braced himself for the impact. In that moment, with clarity born of desperation, Elizabeth remembered the pistol she had taken from the dead bandit. It was tucked in the pocket of Macca's jacket, which she still wore. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, pulling it free as she struggled to her knees. The bear was upon Massacre now, its massive paws swinging in a deadly arc. Massacre ducked beneath the blow, slashing upward with his knife, but the movement put him off balance. The bear's second swing caught him across the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Elizabeth raised the pistol with both hands, fighting to steady her aim despite her trembling arms. The bear turned toward Massacre's fallen form, jaws open in a roar that seemed to shake the very air. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the marsh, startling a flock of birds into flight from a nearby tree. The bear staggered, a red bloom appearing on its neck where the bullet had found its mark. It swayed on its feet, took one lurching step toward Massacre, then collapsed with a ground-shaking thud. Silence fell, broken only by the distant calls of the startled birds and Elizabeth's ragged breathing. She lowered the pistol slowly, unable to believe what had just happened. Massacre pushed himself to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. He stared at the fallen bear, then at Elizabeth, his expression a mixture of pain and something else, respect perhaps, or surprise. "Good shot," he said simply. Elizabeth looked down at the pistol in her hands, still warm from discharge. "I didn't think so. She trailed off, suddenly lightheaded. Massacre crossed to her side, examining the bear briefly before kneeling beside her. "You saved my life." He said it matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "Debt between us now." "There's no debt," Elizabeth replied, finding her voice. "You've saved mine twice over." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Then we are even." But as their eyes met over the body of the fallen bear, Elizabeth knew that nothing between them would ever be that simple again. Something had changed, a shift as subtle yet profound as the turning of the seasons. They had crossed a boundary, invisible but real, and there would be no going back. The bear's massive form lay still, its blood darkening the marsh grass. Massacre knelt beside it, murmuring words in Dakota that Elizabeth couldn't understand. His hand rested briefly on the animal's head in what seemed like a gesture of respect. "We take what bear offers," he said, rising to his feet with a slight wince. "Meat, fur, claws, nothing wasted." Elizabeth nodded, though the prospect of butchering the massive creature made her stomach turn. She had seen animals dressed for cooking before, but never something so large, never so soon after the kill. "Your shoulder," she said, noticing the way he held it stiffly. "It needs tending." Massacre glanced at the wound where the bear's claws had torn through his shirt and into the flesh beneath. "Small hurt. Bear medicine will help." Before Elizabeth could question him further, he drew his knife and began the process of harvesting what they needed from the bear. She watched, initially hesitant, but gradually drawn in by the methodical precision of his work. He explained each step which parts were valuable, how they would be used, the purpose of each careful cut. Despite her initial reluctance, Elizabeth found herself assisting, following his instructions and learning. The work was messy and difficult, but there was something honest about it, a direct connection to survival that she had never experienced in her previous life. The sun was beginning its descent by the time they finished taking what they could. Carry. Massacre wrapped choice cuts of meat in large leaves, along with the bear's gallbladder, which he explained had powerful medicinal properties. The claws he removed with particular care, stringing them on a leather cord. "We cannot stay here," he said, glancing at the sky. "Blood scent travels, attracts predators." They moved away from the marsh, heading toward a small grove of trees that offered some shelter for the night. The day's exertions had taken their toll on both of them. Elizabeth's muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, and Massacre's injured shoulder had begun to stiffen noticeably. As they set up camp, Elizabeth insisted on examining his wound. "I may not know your medicine," she said firmly, "but I know a wound that needs cleaning when I see one." To her surprise, Massacre acquiesced without argument. He sat on a fallen log and pulled his torn shirt aside to reveal 3 deep gashes across his upper back and shoulder. The wounds were clean cuts rather than jagged tears, but deep enough to be concerning. Elizabeth heated water in the small pot from Massacre's pack, then used strips torn from her petticoat to bathe the wounds. Massacre sat motionless throughout, only the occasional tightening of his jaw betraying his discomfort. "In Philadelphia," she said, working carefully to avoid causing unnecessary pain. "I volunteered at the charity hospital. Mostly I read to patients or brought them water, but I watched the nurses tend to wounds." "You have healer's hands," Massacre observed. "Gentle, but not afraid." The simple compliment warmed something in Elizabeth that had been cold since the massacre. "My mother wanted me to be a proper lady, music, embroidery, French conversation, but I was always more interested in practical things." She smiled sadly. It disappointed her terribly. Why? Practice keeps you alive. In my world, ladies aren't supposed to concern themselves with survival. They're decorative, like porcelain figurines on a mantel. Massacre snorted. Strange world, where women learn useless things. When the wounds were clean, he showed her how to prepare a poultice using the bear's gallbladder mixed with herbs from his medicine pouch. The paste had a strong, bitter smell that made Elizabeth's nose wrinkle. But Massacre assured her it would prevent the wounds from festering. As night fell, they built a small fire. Massacre cooked strips of bear meat on sticks over the flames, the fat sizzling as it dripped into the fire. The smell made Elizabeth's mouth water, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. The meat was rich and gamey, unlike anything she had tasted before. Elizabeth found herself enjoying it, despite her initial misgivings. They ate in companionable silence, the crackle of the fire and distant night sounds of the prairie creating a peaceful backdrop. "Tell your husband," Massacre said suddenly. The request caught Elizabeth off guard. She set down the bone she had been gnawing, gathering her thoughts. Robert was kind, ambitious, very certain of himself and his place in the world. She paused, searching for words that felt honest yet respectful. "We were not a love match, but he treated me well." "You mourn him?" The directness of the question might have offended her once, but Elizabeth had come to appreciate Massacre's straightforward manner. "Yes," she said after consideration, "not as a woman mourns a great love, perhaps, but as one mourns the loss of something valuable, potential, possibility." Massacre nodded, seeming to understand. "Death steals the future, not just the present." "What about you?" Elizabeth asked, venturing into territory they had not yet explored. "Is there someone waiting for you? A wife?" A shadow crossed his face, quickly masked. "There was a woman, Wichapi, means star, from a neighboring village." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. 2 winters ago, sickness came. Many died. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly, recognizing the shared experience of loss that connected them. Massacre shrugged, the gesture seemingly casual, but belied by the tension in his features. "Life continues. Must look forward, not back." His words echoed Elizabeth's own thoughts since the massacre. Looking back brought only pain and regret. Looking forward, uncertain as it was, offered at least the possibility of something better. They prepared for sleep, Massacre insisting on taking the first watch despite his injury. Elizabeth wrapped herself in the blanket he offered, surprised by how quickly exhaustion overtook her. Her last conscious thought was that she should be more afraid, alone in the wilderness with a man from a culture she barely understood. Yet, somehow, she felt safer than she had in days. She woke to Massacre's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Someone comes, many horses." The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Elizabeth sat up quickly, instantly alert. "The bandits?" "No. Different." Massacre was already gathering their few belongings, movements swift and silent despite his injured shoulder. Soldiers, blue coats. Elizabeth's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and apprehension. U.S. cavalry meant safety, protection, return to civilization. For her. For Massacre, they might represent something very different. "How many?" she whispered. 8, maybe 10, coming from the south." He handed her a small pack of provisions. "You go. Meet them." Elizabeth stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "White. Soldiers help white women." His expression was carefully neutral. "Take you to the fort. Safety." Understanding dawned slowly. "You want me to leave you?" "Is the best chance. Tell soldiers about bandits. Tell the truth of the massacre." Elizabeth felt something rebel within her at the suggestion. After all they had been through together, the idea of simply walking away seemed unthinkable. "And what about you? Where will you go?" "Continue north. To my people." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Better this way." "Better for whom?" she demanded, a flare of anger surprising her with its intensity. "I wouldn't be alive without you. I won't just abandon you now." Massacre's gaze finally lifted to meet hers, something unreadable in their dark depths. "Soldiers see a Dakota man with white woman. Ask. No questions. Shoot first." The harsh reality of his words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. He was right, of course. The soldiers would likely assume the worst, that he had captured her, perhaps harmed her. In their eyes, a savage with a white woman could only mean one thing. "Then we'll avoid them," she said firmly. "Continue your camp together." Massacre studied her face, searching for something, doubt perhaps, or fear. Finding none, he gave a single nod. "Paths are more dangerous now. Soldiers patrol the borders of Dakota land." "I understand." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. Decision made. "I'm not afraid." A ghost of a smile touched Massacre's lips. "No, not afraid." He slung his pack over his good shoulder. "Come, we go before light grows stronger." They slipped away from their campsite as the sounds of the approaching patrol grew clearer. Horses' hooves, the jingle of tack, male voices calling commands. Instead of heading directly north as they had planned, Massacre led them west, using a line of hills to screen their movement from distant observers. As the sun rose fully, Elizabeth glanced back once at the dust cloud that marked the soldiers' passage, her last connection to the world she had known slipping away behind her. The sight should have filled her with regret or longing, but instead she felt only certainty. Her path lay forward, not back. Whatever awaited her in Massacre's world, she would face it with the same courage that had kept her alive thus far. She turned away from the soldiers and followed Massacre into the unknown. The day grew warmer as they traveled. the sun climbing high in a cloudless sky. Massacre led them through increasingly rugged terrain, a landscape of sharp ridges and hidden valleys that seemed designed to confuse and mislead. He moved with the confidence of someone returning to familiar ground, occasionally pausing to study landmarks visible only to his experienced eye. Elizabeth followed as best she could, noting with surprise that her body was adapting to the demands of their journey. The aches in her muscles had transformed from sharp pain to a dull, persistent throb that she could push aside with sufficient determination. Her city-bred softness was being steadily replaced by a newfound resilience. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the cavalry patrol. Massacre finally slowed their pace, allowing a brief rest beside a small spring that bubbled up between moss-covered rocks. "We make good time," he observed, filling their water skins. "Reach my people's summer camp by tomorrow if there is no more trouble." Elizabeth knelt beside him, splashing cool water on her face. "Will your people welcome me?" The question had been weighing on her mind with increasing urgency as they drew closer to their destination. Massacre's expression turned thoughtful. "Some yes, some no." He met her gaze directly. "Chief Grey Wolf is a wise man, but cautious with white settlers. Too many broken promises. I'm hardly a settler now," Elizabeth said with a wry smile. "More of a refugee? Truth." He nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "But still, prepare for a difficult welcome. Stay close to me." They continued their journey, angling northeast, through a series of narrow passes that gradually opened into a broader valley. The vegetation changed subtly, more pine and spruce appearing among the cottonwoods, the grass growing shorter and more sparse on the rocky slopes. As they walked, Massacre began pointing out features of the landscape that would have escaped Elizabeth's. Notice the nearly invisible game trail they followed, plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, signs of animals that had passed recently. "There," he said, indicating a patch of disturbed earth beneath an overhanging ledge. "Badger den, good sign." "Why is that good?" Elizabeth asked, seeing nothing remarkable about the burrow. "Badger chooses safe places, where food, water close, where larger predators do not hunt." He tapped his temple. "Badger smart. We learn from badgers." Elizabeth found herself absorbing these lessons eagerly, filing away knowledge that would have seemed irrelevant in her previous life, but now might mean the difference between survival and death. There was a strange freedom in this new existence, stripped of social conventions and expectations, reduced to the essential business of staying alive. Late in the afternoon they created a ridge, and Massacre suddenly raised his hand, signaling for Elizabeth to stop. He dropped into a crouch, motioning for her to do the same. "What is it?" she whispered, scanning the landscape ahead but seeing nothing unusual. Massacre pointed to a distant rise where a single figure on horseback was silhouetted against the sky. "Watcher." Elizabeth squinted against the sun's glare. "One of your people?" "Yes." "Scout who watches the borders of our hunting grounds." Massacre studied the distant figure. "He sees us already." As if in confirmation, the scout raised a hand in a deliberate gesture. Massacre stood slowly and returned the signal, adding a second motion that Elizabeth couldn't interpret. "Now he knows I will return with a stranger," Massacre explained. "He will ride to camp, bring news." "Is that good or bad?" Elizabeth asked, rising to stand beside him. "Depends on news already in camp." A shadow crossed Massacre's face. "Last month, tensions with white settlers grew worse. More trouble since I left." He didn't need to finish the thought. Elizabeth understood the precarious position she might be in, a white woman arriving in a Dakota camp during a time of conflict between their peoples. The scout wheeled his horse and disappeared over the rise, riding hard toward the north. Massacre watched him go, then turned to Elizabeth with an uncharacteristically grave expression. "Listen carefully," he said. When we reach camp, some may speak harsh words. Show anger. Do not react. Do not show fear. His eyes held hers with urgent intensity. I give protection, but you must be strong yourself. Elizabeth nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. I understand. Good. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. Unwrapping it, he revealed a carved stone bear, small enough to fit in her palm, polished to a dull sheen by years of handling. My father made this, Massacre said, pressing it into her hand. Protection's spirit. Bear you killed gives strength. This gives... He searched for the word, belonging. Elizabeth closed her fingers around the small carving, deeply moved by the gesture. I can't take this. It was your father's. Now it's yours, he said firmly. Keep close. When afraid, remember the bear fell by your hand. You earned a place. The weight of the small stone in her palm felt somehow significant, a tangible connection to Massacre's world, a talisman against the unknown challenges ahead. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, feeling its reassuring solidity against her hip. They continued their journey as the shadows lengthened across the valley. Elizabeth noticed Massacre becoming increasingly alert, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. Once, he paused abruptly, head cocked as if listening, though she heard nothing unusual. Someone follows, he said quietly, hand moving to his knife. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine, despite the afternoon warmth. The bandits? No, different. He studied the trail behind them, eyes narrowed. One person, moving quite, skilled. Another scout? Maybe. His expression remained troubled. Or someone who tracks both of us. They resumed walking. But now Massacre adjusted their path, leading them through areas of rocky ground where tracks would be difficult to leave. He set a quick pace that had Elizabeth struggling to keep up, her newly developed stamina tested by the rough terrain and increasing elevation. The sun was beginning to set when they entered a dense stand of pines. The sudden dimness beneath the canopy was disorienting after hours in open country. Elizabeth stayed close to Massacre, fighting the impression that eyes watched from the shadowed spaces between trees. Without warning, Massacre stopped. Elizabeth nearly collided with his back, catching herself just in time. She peered around him to see what had caused the abrupt halt. 3 Dakota warriors stood blocking their path, bows drawn and arrows pointed directly at them. Their faces were painted with red and black streaks, their expressions impassive and unwelcoming. One of them, the center figure, taller than the others, spoke sharply in Dakota. Massacre responded calmly in the same language, his hands held slightly away from his weapons in a non-threatening gesture. The exchange continued for several tense moments, voices low but intensity clear even to Elizabeth, who couldn't understand the words. Finally, the tall warrior lowered his bow slightly, though his companions maintained their aim. He switched to heavily accented English, directing his words at Elizabeth. Why did you come here, white woman? Elizabeth stepped forward, grateful that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. I survived a massacre. Massacre saved my life. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Massacre by who? White men, bandits who attack both your people and mine, then blame Indians for their crimes. A flicker of surprise crossed the warrior's face before his expression hardened again. You witnessed this? Yes, Elizabeth said firmly. I saw everything. I can testify to the truth. The 3 warriors exchanged glances. The tall one spoke again to Massacre, who nodded and replied. After another moment of consideration, the warrior gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. Chief must hear this, he said. You come, but... His gaze fixed on Elizabeth with unmistakable warning. You walk with blind eyes. Massacre turned to Elizabeth, his expression conveying the seriousness of the situation. They fear you will learn a path to the village, for protection. I understand, Elizabeth said, though the prospect of being blindfolded in this unfamiliar wilderness sent a surge of anxiety through her. The tall warrior produced a strip of woven cloth. Massacre took it from him and approached Elizabeth. "Trust me," he said quietly, "for her ears alone. No harm comes while I guide." Elizabeth nodded, closing her eyes as he placed the cloth over them, tying it securely at the back of her head. The sudden darkness was disorienting, heightening her other senses, the scent of pine, the sound of wind through branches, the murmur of voices in a language she couldn't understand. She felt Massacre's hand close around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "I lead, step where I step." They began to move forward, Elizabeth placing her trust entirely in Massacre's guidance. It was perhaps the most vulnerable she had been since the massacre, unable to see, surrounded by those who might wish her harm, in territory utterly unknown to her. Yet strangely, as they journeyed deeper into Dakota land, she felt something unexpected beginning to take root within her. Not fear, though that was certainly present. Something else, a sense that every step carried her further from the woman she had been and closer to someone new, someone stronger. Someone who might, against all odds, find a place in this harsh new world. The carved bear pressed against her hip with each step, a reminder of Massacre's words, "You earned a place." She hoped, as they led her blindfolded toward the unknown, that it would prove true. The journey through darkness seemed endless. Elizabeth concentrated on the pressure of Massacre's hand guiding her, the sound of his voice occasionally murmuring instructions. "Step high here, duck branches, careful, stones." The only constants in her blindfolded world. The voices of the warriors surrounded her, their Dakota language flowing like water over rocks, sometimes sharp with what sounded like disagreement, other times low and urgent. When they finally stopped, she could sense a change in the air. Smoke from cooking fires, the distant sound of voices and movement, the barking of dogs. They had reached the Dakota camp. "Ready?" Massacre asked quietly near her ear. Elizabeth nodded, her throat too dry for words. The blindfold was removed, and she blinked against the fading evening light, taking in her surroundings. The Dakota summer camp spread before her in the sheltered valley. Perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a rough circle, some constructed of hides, stretched over wooden frames, others more permanent structures of bark and wood. Cook fires flickered throughout the camp, sending thin columns of smoke into the darkening sky. Children paused in their play to stare at the newcomers. Women stood from their work, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility, and men approached with hands resting on weapons. Massacre stood tall beside her, his face composed but alert. The tall warrior who had confronted them in the forest moved ahead, calling out to the gathering crowd. A ripple of reaction passed through the assembly. Surprise, anger, suspicion. A path cleared through the people as an elderly man emerged from the largest lodge at the center of the camp. His face was deeply lined with age, his long gray hair bound with a single eagle feather. Despite his years, he moved with the straight-back dignity of one accustomed to authority. "Chief Grey Wolf," Massacre said under his breath. "Show respect. Do not speak until spoken to." The chief approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Elizabeth's appearance, the torn and stained dress, the tangled hair, the mixture of fear and determination in her stance. He spoke in Dakota to Massacre, who responded at length, occasionally gesturing toward Elizabeth or in the direction from which they had traveled. Elizabeth stood silently, acutely aware of the stares from all sides. Children whispered behind their hands, nudged by mothers into silence. Young warriors watched with undisguised suspicion. A few of the older women studied her with expressions that seemed more calculating than hostile. Finally, Chief Grey Wolf turned his attention fully to Elizabeth. addressing her in halting but understandable English. "Maka says you survive when all others die. Says you witness the truth of who kills your people?" "Yes," Elizabeth replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I saw everything. It was white men, bandits pretending to be Indians. They've been raiding both settler wagons and native villages, stirring hatred between our peoples." The chief's weathered face remained impassive. "Why should we believe white woman's words? White tongues often speak lies about Dakota." Elizabeth felt the weight of every eye upon her. This moment, her response, would determine not just her welcome but possibly her survival. Her fingers found the carved bear in her pocket, drawing strength from its solidity. "I have no reason to lie," she said. "I've lost everything. My husband, my possessions, my future in Oregon. The men who destroyed all that are still out there, free to continue their crimes against both our peoples. The truth is all I have left to offer." Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and spoke at length to a small group of older men who had gathered behind him, council members, Elizabeth guessed, by their attentive posture and the respect shown to them by others. One of them, a man with a deeply scarred face and only one eye, spoke forcefully, gesturing toward Elizabeth with obvious disapproval. Another, wearing an elaborate necklace of bear claws, seemed to argue in her favor, pointing to Maka's wounded shoulder. The debate continued as darkness fell completely over the camp. More torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across the gathered faces. Elizabeth stood motionless beside Maka, determined not to show the exhaustion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, Chief Grey Wolf raised his hand, silencing the council's discussion. He turned back to Elizabeth and Maka. "Woman, we'll stay," he announced. 3 days. Council hears the full story tomorrow when minds rested." He pointed to a small lodge at the edge of the camp. "Stay there, watched always." With that, he turned and walked back toward the central lodge, the council members following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, though many continued to cast curious or hostile glances toward Elizabeth. Maka let out a small breath. "Good outcome," he said quietly. "Better than expected. Being watched at all times is good," Elizabeth whispered back as they began walking toward the designated lodge. "Not killing immediately is good," Maka replied with unexpected frankness. "Rest we work with." The small lodge was sparsely furnished, 2 sleeping pallets of pine boughs covered with buffalo robes, a central fire pit, a few clay vessels for water. A young woman entered shortly after them, silently placing a wooden bowl of stew and a water skin near the fire before departing, without meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "Who was that?" Elizabeth asked, sinking gratefully onto one of the pallets as her legs finally gave way beneath her. "Singing Bird, my sister's daughter." Maka sat across from her, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "She is curious about you." She didn't look at me. "Dakota way. Watch without seeming to watch." A hint of amusement touched his expression. "Women in my family see everything." Elizabeth managed a tired smile at that. "Women everywhere see everything. Men just don't notice us." This drew a small chuckle from Maka, a sound Elizabeth realized she had never heard from him before. The brief moment of lightness felt precious amid the tension of their situation. They ate the stew, a rich mixture of venison, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots, in companionable silence. Elizabeth found herself studying the interior of the lodge, noting the craftsmanship of the structure, the practical arrangement of the sparse belongings. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked finally. "Council meets. You tell a story, full story, every detail. They decide if it is the truth or a lie." Maka's expression grew serious. "Important to remember everything exactly. Small differences cause suspicion. And if they decide I'm lying?" Maka didn't answer immediately, which was enough. "Sleep," he said instead. "Need strength for tomorrow." Elizabeth lay down on the buffalo robe, its musky scent oddly comforting. After days in the wilderness, exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind raced with anxiety about the coming day. Her testimony before the council would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future relationship between the Dakota and nearby settlers. "Maka," she said softly into the darkness, "thank you for bringing me here, for trusting me." There was a long pause before he replied. "You trusted first, following Dakota warriors into unknown land. I had no choice. Always choose," he countered. "Could have gone to soldiers. Choose the safety of your own people." Elizabeth considered this. He was right, of course. She had made a choice when she decided to continue with him rather than seek out the cavalry patrol. A choice that had led her here, to this lodge, to tomorrow's testimony. "Get sleep," Maka said, his voice already heavy with approaching slumber. Tomorrow comes soon. Despite her anxiety, Elizabeth found herself drifting off, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the Dakota camp. Distant voices, the occasional laugh or cry of a child, dogs barking at something in the night. Different from the sounds of Philadelphia, different from the wagon train, yet somehow containing the same essential human elements. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a strange one. That perhaps the distance between her world and Maka's was not as vast as she had once believed. Morning arrived with a soft touch on her shoulder. Elizabeth opened her eyes to find a young woman, Singing Bird, Maka's niece, kneeling beside her pallet. The girl's dark eyes were serious but not unfriendly as she offered a small wooden cup of steaming liquid. "Drink," she said, her English surprisingly clear. "Give strength to the council." Elizabeth sat up, accepting the cup with murmured thanks. The tea was bitter but invigorating, clearing the fog of sleep from her mind. She glanced around the lodge to find that Maka was already gone. "Where is—" "Uncle speaks with elders," Singing Bird answered, setting out a clean dress, simple in design but carefully made from soft buckskin. "You wear this, your dress." She gestured at Elizabeth's torn and stained clothing with a slight grimace. Elizabeth hesitated, touched by the unexpected kindness, but uncertain about adopting Dakota dress before the council. Would it seem presumptuous, an attempt to curry favor? Singing Bird seemed to read her thoughts. "Council respects clean appearance, shows respect back." She pointed to Elizabeth's matted hair. "I help with this too." Recognizing the wisdom in the young woman's advice, Elizabeth accepted the dress and allowed Singing Bird to help her wash and comb her tangled hair into a simple braid. The transformation was remarkable. The buckskin dress fit surprisingly well, and the simple act of being clean again restored something of her dignity. "Thank you," Elizabeth said when they had finished. "This is very kind." Singing Bird shrugged, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Uncle says you are a brave woman. Shot bear to save him." She touched the bear claw necklace she wore. "Bear spirit strong in you now." Before Elizabeth could respond, the hide covering the lodge entrance was pulled aside. A stern-faced warrior, one of those who had escorted them to the camp the previous evening, gestured for her to follow. "Council waits," he said gruffly. With a deep breath and a final grateful nod to Singing Bird, Elizabeth stepped out to face whatever judgment awaited her. The council lodge stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others and marked by totemic symbols painted on its exterior. As Elizabeth approached, flanked by her stern warrior escort, she could see that a significant gathering had already assembled inside. The morning sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top, casting dappled patterns across the assembled faces. Chief Grey Wolf sat at the head of the circle, his weathered face impassive. To his right was the scarred elder who had argued against her the previous evening, his single eye regarding her with undisguised suspicion. To his left, the man with the bear claw necklace, the one who had spoken in her favor. nodded slightly. As she entered, Maka stood to one side, his posture formal, face carefully neutral. He did not acknowledge her directly, but his presence provided a measure of reassurance. "Come forward," Chief Greywolf instructed, gesturing to the center of the circle. "Sit here." Elizabeth took her place on the woven mat indicated, conscious of the many eyes upon her. Women of the tribe had gathered at the periphery of the lodge, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Among them, she spotted Singing Bird, who offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You claim to witness an attack on a wagon train," Greywolf began without preamble. "Tell us what you saw, every detail, from the beginning." Elizabeth took a deep breath, centering herself. This was perhaps the most important story she would ever tell. Lives, both Dakota and settler, might depend on her ability to convey the truth convincingly. "We were part of the Whitaker wagon train," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 23 of us, bound for Oregon territory, families mostly, the Simmons, the Petersons, the Millers. My husband Robert and I joined in Independence. She described the journey, 7 weeks on the trail, the crossing of the Missouri River, the gradual shift in landscape as they entered the plains. The council listened silently, neither encouraging nor interrupting her narrative. 3 mornings ago, just before dawn, I went to gather kindling for the breakfast fire," Elizabeth continued, forcing herself to relive the terrible moments she had been trying to forget. "We had camped in a small valley near a stream. I was maybe 100 yards from the nearest wagon when I heard the first shots." Her voice remained steady as she recounted the horror of what followed. Hiding in the tall grass, watching as the attackers systematically murdered the members of the wagon train. She described the men in detail, their clothing, their weapons, the way they moved and spoke. They were white men, she emphasized. Some wore pieces of native dress, feathers, beaded strips, but it was obviously false. A disguise. They spoke English to each other and used white men's curses. The one-eyed elder leaned forward. "How do you survive when all others die?" "I was already away from camp when the attack began," Elizabeth explained. "I hid in the grass, then under an overturned wagon. They were careless, confident no one had escaped, more interested in looting than searching thoroughly." She described her 3 days alone, the desperate flight through unfamiliar territory, finally encountering the same men at their camp. "I heard them talking," she said, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "They spoke of the good haul from the wagons. One said they should have kept one of the women. Another said, 'Next time we won't be so hasty.' They were the same men who attacked us, not Indians as they wanted it to appear." The council members exchanged glances. The man with the bear claw necklace spoke in Dakota to Greywolf, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Elizabeth. "These men, you know who they are?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I never saw them before the attack, but they seemed familiar with the territory. They mentioned a trading post to the east where they could sell the stolen goods." "Fort Matthews," Maka interjected, speaking for the first time. Several heads turned toward him. "Only trading post. 3 days' ride east, known to deal with stolen goods." Greywolf's expression darkened. "Matthews' man has brought much trouble. Buys furs from Dakota land. Claims we steal from white trappers." The one-eyed elder spoke rapidly in Dakota, gesturing emphatically. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand his words, the meaning was clear. He remained unconvinced, suspicious of her account. "Running Fox asks why we should believe you," Greywolf translated. "Says white woman would say anything to save herself." Elizabeth felt a surge of frustration but kept her voice measured. "What reason would I have to lie? If I wanted to blame your people for the massacre, I would have gone to the soldiers we saw yesterday. I would not be here alone among you, telling a story that places blame on my own kind." This caused a murmur among the gathered council. The logic of her argument was difficult to refute. "There is more," Maka said, stepping forward slightly. Women could have joined soldiers. Choose to continue with me instead. Choose truth over the easy path. Running Fox spoke again, his tone challenging. Maka responded with equal intensity, and soon multiple voices joined the debate, the Dakota language flowing too rapidly for Elizabeth to follow any of it. Grey Wolf raised his hand, silencing the council. "One more question," he said to Elizabeth. "These men who attack, how many?" "I saw 5 clearly," she replied. "There may have been more. Describe a leader." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, recalling the man who had seemed to direct the others. Tall, broad-shouldered, a scar from his left eye to his jaw, red-brown beard streaked with grey, wore a black hat with a silver band, carried 2 pistols with bone handles. A shocked silence fell over the council. Elizabeth opened her eyes to find every face staring at her with new intensity. "You know him," she said slowly, recognizing the reaction. "Who is he?" Grey Wolf exchanged glances with the other elders before answering. "Man you describe is Nathaniel Blackwood, once an army scout. Now," he searched for the English word, "outlaw." He led attacks on Dakota hunting parties. 3 moons ago, I raided a small village south of here, kill many, including my brother, Maka added quietly. My brother's wife, their son, Elizabeth. Turned to him, understanding dawning. This was why he had been tracking the bandits, why he had been so quick to help her. Their paths had converged through shared tragedy. Blackwood claims Dakota attacked settlers, Grey Wolf continued. The army believes, sends soldiers, threatens war if raids continue. But it's not your people raiding, Elizabeth said, anger kindling within her. It's Blackwood and his men, creating conflict for their own profit. Yes, the chief confirmed grimly. But who believes the Dakota word against white man's? Even with a peace treaty, white soldiers are quick to blame, slow to listen. The elder, with the bear-claw necklace, spoke at length, his tone measured but forceful. Others joined in, the debate resuming with new urgency. Elizabeth watched their faces, wishing she could understand their words, but reading much in their expressions and gestures. Finally, Grey Wolf called for silence once more. He studied Elizabeth thoughtfully before speaking. "Council believes your words carry truth," he announced. "Story fits with what we know of Blackwood. What we do not know is what to do with you now." Elizabeth hadn't considered this question. In focusing on convincing the council of the truth, she hadn't thought beyond that immediate goal. "I want justice," she said firmly, "for my husband, for the others who died, for your people who have been blamed for Blackwood's crimes." "Justice is hard to find on the frontier," Grey Wolf replied. "White law does not listen to Dakota, and white woman who lives with Dakota—" He shook his head. "White law does not listen to her either." The truth of this statement settled heavily in the lodge. Elizabeth was caught between worlds, no longer fully part of the white settler society, not truly accepted among the Dakota. Her testimony would be dismissed or discredited in both courts. There must be a way, she insisted, someone who would listen, who would have the authority to investigate Blackwood's gang. Maka, who had been silent during the latter part of... The council stepped forward. "There is one. Indian agent Thomas Calloway at Fort Laramie, man of honor, has worked for fair treatment of both peoples." Several council members nodded in recognition of the name. Even Running Fox, the suspicious one-eyed elder, grunted what sounded like grudging agreement. "Calloway knows Dakota speaks the truth," Grey Wolf confirmed. "But Fort Laramie took many days' journey, dangerous path." "I'll go," Elizabeth said without hesitation. "I'll testify to what I saw." Her declaration caused another stir among the council. Maka's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or concern, possibly both. Grey Wolf conferred briefly with the other elders before turning back to Elizabeth. "Council will consider this path. Until a decision is made, you stay in camp. Learn our ways." His gaze was penetrating. Show if you truly stand. For truth, or only for your own survival. With that, the council session ended. The elders rose, filing out of the lodge with measured dignity. The women followed, many casting curious glances at Elizabeth as they departed. Massacre approached her as the lodge emptied. "You did well," he said quietly. "Council rarely believes in an outsider so quickly." "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional strain of reliving the massacre. "Now we wait. Council debates. Decide." He offered his hand to help her rise from the mat. "And you learn what it means to live among Dakota." As they stepped outside into the bright midday sun, Elizabeth realized that a new chapter of her journey was beginning. The testimony was over, but the greater challenge, finding her place in this unfamiliar world, was just beginning. The days that followed Elizabeth's testimony unfolded in a rhythm entirely foreign to her previous life. While the council deliberated on the matter of Fort Laramie, she found herself immersed in the daily patterns of Dakota existence, not as a guest or observer, but as a participant. Singing Bird became her guide and reluctant teacher, showing Elizabeth how to perform the tasks expected of Dakota women. The chief's decision that she should learn their ways was being taken quite literally by the tribe. "You hold wrong," Singing Bird sighed, adjusting Elizabeth's grip on the bone scraper she was using to prepare a deerskin. "Like this. Firm but gentle. Too hard damages hide. Too soft leaves flesh." Elizabeth repositioned her hands, feeling the blisters forming despite the calluses she had developed during her days in the wilderness. The work was physically demanding in ways she had never experienced. The constant bending, the repetitive motions, the precision required, even when muscles trembled with fatigue. "In Philadelphia," she said between strokes, "I had a maid who did the laundry and cooking. I spent my mornings practicing piano or embroidery." Singing Bird looked puzzled. "Piano?" Elizabeth tried to explain the instrument, mimicking the motion. "Of playing keys," Singing Bird laughed. "Sounds like a man's toy, not useful." She gestured at the half-scraped hide. "This keeps the family warm in winter. What does piano do?" The question gave Elizabeth pause. What indeed? So many of the accomplishments she had been raised to value seemed absurdly impractical in this new context. As the afternoon sun beat down, a group of children ran past, shouting and laughing in a game of chase. One small boy, perhaps 5 years old, stumbled and fell heavily, scraping his knee on a stone. Instead of crying, he pushed himself up, brushed off the dirt, and rejoined the game with barely a wince. "Dakota children learn early," Singing Bird commented, following Elizabeth's gaze. "Pain is a teacher, weakness not honored." "In my world, mothers rush to comfort crying children," Elizabeth said. "We protect them from pain when we can." Singing Bird's expression turned thoughtful. "Different ways. Not wrong, just different. Here children must be strong to survive," she returned to her work. "Like you must be strong now." The observation struck Elizabeth more deeply than Singing Bird likely intended. Strength in this world was measured differently, not by social graces or marriageability, but by one's ability to endure, to contribute, to survive. By midday, they joined the other women at the cooking fires. Elizabeth's hands were raw, her back aching, but she felt a strange sense of accomplishment in the properly prepared hide, in the skills, however rudimentary, she was beginning to acquire. Some of the women still regarded her with suspicion, keeping their distance and speaking Dakota when she was near, clearly discussing her. Others had begun to accept her presence with grudging tolerance, occasionally correcting her technique or offering small nods of approval when she managed a task correctly. One elderly woman, White Feather, Massacre had told her, a respected healer, had taken a particular interest in Elizabeth. Though she spoke no English, she communicated through gestures and expressions, showing Elizabeth which plants could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, which were to be avoided. She lost daughter to white man's sickness, Singing Bird explained when Elizabeth asked about the old woman's attention. Thinks maybe you were sent to learn her knowledge before she joins your ancestors. The responsibility of this unexpected mentorship weighed on Elizabeth. These were not simple cooking tips or housekeeping skills being shared. They were survival knowledge accumulated over generations, sacred in their way. Throughout these days of learning, Massacre remained a distant figure. She caught glimpses of him in council meetings, training with younger warriors, and departing on hunting expeditions. When their paths did cross, he acknowledged her with a nod or brief greeting, but the easy companionship of their journey seemed to have evaporated within the confines of the camp. The evening of her 4th day among the Dakota, Elizabeth sat, alone outside her lodging, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The small carving of the bear rested in her palm, its smooth surface warmed by her touch. "Bear spirit speaks to you?" Massacre's voice came from behind her, surprising Elizabeth with its suddenness. He moved silently even in camp. "I don't know about spirits," she admitted as he sat beside her on the fallen log, "but it reminds me that I'm stronger than I once believed." Massacre nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "Council finishes discussion tomorrow. Decision comes about Fort Laramie." Elizabeth's heart quickened. Have they given any indication of their thinking? Divided. Some say the risk is too great. Blackwood's men watch trails. Army patrols suspicious of Dakota. Others say truth must be told, no matter the danger. He glanced at her. "You still wish to go?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "For justice, for your brother's family, for mine." A moment of silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way their recent interactions had not been. "Why have you been avoiding me?" Elizabeth asked finally, the question that had been troubling her for days. Massacre's expression remained carefully neutral. "Not avoiding, giving space. Here, you are white woman in Dakota camp, different from women alone in the wilderness." He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Some watch how I treat you. Judge both of us by this." Understanding dawned slowly. Their closeness on the journey, born of necessity and shared danger, carried different implications within. The social structure of the camp, Massacre's position, his respect among his people, could be compromised by appearing too attached to an outsider. "I see," Elizabeth said softly. "I wouldn't want to cause problems for you here." "Not a problem," Massacre corrected. "Complication. Different." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the camp's edge. Warriors were gathering, weapons in hand, responding to something beyond Elizabeth's view. Massacre rose immediately. "Alert and tense, stay here," he instructed, already moving toward the disturbance. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before following at a discreet distance. Whatever was happening might affect her as well, and she was tired of being sheltered from difficult truths. At the camp's perimeter, a small group of warriors surrounded a kneeling figure, a white man, bloodied and bound, his face a mass of cuts and bruises. Chief Grey Wolf stood before him, expression grave, as Running Fox reported something in rapid Dakota. "Found near Western Creek," Massacre translated quietly for Elizabeth, who had come to stand beside him despite his instructions. "Watching camp. When caught, try to fight." The captive raised his head, revealing a face that made Elizabeth gasp with recognition. Despite the injuries, she knew him, one of Blackwood's men, the youngest of the bandits she had glimpsed at their camp. Grey Wolf turned at her reaction. "You know this man?" "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed, stepping forward. "He was with the bandits, one of Blackwood's gang." A ripple of tension passed through the gathered Dakota. The captive's eyes widened as he recognized Elizabeth. "You're dead," he rasped, disbelief evident beneath his fear. "You died in the wagons with the rest." "Clearly not," Elizabeth replied coldly. "Unlike my husband, unlike the children your gang murdered." Grey Wolf addressed the captive in halting English. "Why do you watch our camp?" The young bandit's gaze darted between the armed warriors surrounding him. "Blackwood sent me, said to find the Injun who's been picking us off, the one who took Jenkins with an arrow." His eyes flickered to Massacre. "And to look for any survivors." "From the wagon train." "How did Blackwood know to look here?" Massacre demanded. "Army patrol," the captive replied, desperation loosening his tongue. "They reported seeing a white woman with a Dakota brave heading north. Blackwood figured it had to be the one that got away." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. Blackwood knew she had survived, knew she was a witness to his crimes, and now knew exactly where to find her. Grey Wolf spoke rapidly to the council, members who had joined the gathering. The debate was brief but intense, concluding with a sharp nod from the chief. "Take him to the council lodge," he ordered. "We learn what else he knows." As the warriors hauled the captive away, Grey Wolf turned to Elizabeth and Massacre. "This changes the path ahead. Blackwood now hunts both of you. I know you can tell the truth of his crimes." "All the more reason to reach Fort Laramie," Elizabeth argued, "before he silences us permanently." Grey Wolf studied her with newfound respect. "You have the courage of a Dakota woman, even in white skin." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Council meets now, not tomorrow. Decision cannot wait with the enemy so close." The chief strode toward the council lodge, calling for the elders to join him. Massacre moved to follow, then paused, turning back to Elizabeth. "Stay in your lodge," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument this time. "Post guards outside. I will return when the council finishes." Elizabeth wanted to protest, but recognized the genuine concern in his eyes. This was not about keeping her away from tribal matters, but about protecting her from very real danger. She nodded her agreement and headed back to her small dwelling. Singing Bird was waiting there, her normally cheerful face solemn. "I heard," she said simply. "Bad men come for you." "They might," Elizabeth confirmed, sinking onto her sleeping pallet. "They might come for all of us." The young woman nodded, arranging protective fetishes at the lodge entrance, small bundles of herbs and feathers that Elizabeth had learned were believed to ward off evil. Whether they worked or not, the gesture was touching. "Uncle will protect you," Singing Bird said with absolute certainty. "He has seen your spirit." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Singing Bird seemed surprised by the question. "You do not know. In our ways, when a person saves another from death, spirits are joined. When you killed a bear that would take his life, your spirit spoke to him." She fingered the bear claw at her neck. "This is powerful medicine between warriors." The implications of this cultural belief settled over Elizabeth like a blanket, both comforting and weighty with responsibility. In Massacre's worldview, they were connected not just by circumstance or mutual aid, but by something deeper, something spiritual. As night fell completely over the camp and the council's debate continued in the distance, Elizabeth found herself wondering about the invisible threads that bound people together across the boundaries of culture and experience. She had crossed from one world into another, finding it simultaneously foreign and familiar, frightening and fascinating. And now, it seemed, the violence that had thrust her into this new existence was reaching out to reclaim her. The council's deliberations lasted well into the night. Elizabeth sat in her lodge, listening to the muffled sounds of the camp, hushed conversations outside, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft lullaby a mother sang to quiet her child. Despite the ordinary nature of these sounds, there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present before. The capture of Blackwood's scout had changed everything. Two young warriors stood guard outside her dwelling, their silhouettes occasionally, visible against the hide walls when they moved. Their presence was both reassuring and unsettling. Protection, yes, but also a reminder of the danger that had followed her to this place. Singing Bird had departed after arranging the protective fetishes, summoned to help with women's council business. Elizabeth was left alone with her thoughts and the small carved bear that had become something of a talisman. It was well past midnight when the hide covering her lodge entrance was pushed aside. Maka ducked inside, his expression grave in the dim light of the small fire. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "Council has decided," he said without preamble, settling cross-legged before the fire. Elizabeth sat up straighter, heart quickening. "What will happen?" "Many things." Maka added a small stick to the fire, watching the flames catch. "Camp moves at dawn, deeper into Dakota territory, harder to find. Women, children, and elders go north to summer hunting grounds by a great lake." "And us?" Elizabeth asked, noting his phrasing. Maka met her gaze directly. "We go to Fort Laramie. You, me, 4 warriors. Try to reach Indian Agent Calloway before Blackwood finds us." Relief and anxiety washed through Elizabeth in equal measure. The council had agreed to her plan, but the journey would be perilous with Blackwood actively hunting them. What about the bandit, the one who was caught? A shadow crossed Maka's face. "He gave information, names of others in Blackwood's gang, location of their camp, plans to blame the next raid on the Lakota tribe to the south." He paused. "He will not return to Blackwood." Elizabeth didn't press for details, understanding the implication. The young bandit had met tribal justice for his crimes against the Dakota people. "When do we leave?" she asked instead. "Before dawn, secret path, need to travel light fast." Maka produced a small bundle from his pack. "Brought these for my journey." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal moccasins made of soft deer hide, decorated with subtle beadwork. "Singing Bird made for you. Better than boots for quiet travel." Elizabeth accepted the gift, touched by the young woman's thoughtfulness. "Please thank her for me." "Thank yourself. She says you learn well for white woman." A hint of amusement flickered in Maka's eyes, high praise from Dakota girl. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, packing only essential supplies, reviewing the route they would take, discussing contingencies if they encountered trouble. It was a grim but necessary conversation, both of them acutely aware of the stakes. "Rest now," Maka said finally. "Need strength for days ahead." Elizabeth nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with her mind racing. As Maka rose to leave, she called after him. "What did the council learn about Blackwood's whereabouts? How close is he?" Maka hesitated, clearly debating whether to share this information. 2 days' ride southwest, camp near a trading post called Wilson's Station. "So close," Elizabeth whispered, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. "Yes. Why do we leave different directions, use Dakota paths through hills?" He studied her face. "Are you afraid?" It would have been easy to lie, to pretend bravery she didn't entirely feel. But Elizabeth had learned that honesty between them was more valuable than pride. "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to turn back. Fear is useful only if it makes you act. Remember?" Maka nodded, recognition flickering in his eyes at her reference to her father's teaching. "Good fear makes feet quick, eyes sharp. Bad fear makes your heart freeze." He adjusted his pack. "Your fear is good." With that assessment, he departed, leaving Elizabeth to prepare herself for what might be the most dangerous journey of her life. Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with pursuing shadows and the echoing sound of gunfire. Elizabeth woke before the designated hour, her body tense with anticipation. Outside, the camp was stirring with quiet purpose. Families preparing for their own journey north, warriors readying weapons and horses. Singing Bird appeared as Elizabeth was lacing the new moccasins, entering without announcement as had become her custom. "You leave with Uncle," she said, not a question but a statement. "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed, "to Fort Laramie." The young woman nodded, her expression solemn. From around her neck she removed a small pouch, suspended on a leather cord. "For you, protection on journey." Elizabeth accepted the gift, opening the drawstring to find a small bundle of herbs, a hawk feather, and what appeared to be a polished stone. "Medicine bundle," Singing Bird explained. "Dakota believes good spirits travel with these." She pointed to the stone. "River stone from sacred place. Very old, very powerful." The simple sincerity of the gift touched Elizabeth deeply. "Thank you. I'll keep it close. Maybe someday you return," Singing Bird said, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. "Teach me more about white women's world. Piano." The unfamiliar word sounded strange in her accent. "I'd like that," Elizabeth replied, surprised to find she meant it. In just a few days, this young woman had become something close to a friend, perhaps the first real female friendship Elizabeth had experienced since childhood. Their farewell was brief but heartfelt, cultural differences bridged by the universal language of concern and good wishes. As Singing Bird departed, Elizabeth felt a pang of loss, not just for this budding friendship, but for the entire community she had barely begun to understand. Outside, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, painting the sky in pale pink and gold. The camp was already half dismantled, lodges being taken down with practiced efficiency, possessions packed onto travois pulled by sturdy ponies. Massacre waited at the edge of the clearing with 3 warriors Elizabeth recognized from the council. Stone, Hand, the elder with the bear claw necklace, Swift Elk, a middle-aged warrior known for his tracking skills, and Wolf Runner, younger than the others, but renowned for his endurance. A 4th figure joined them, surprising Elizabeth with his identity, Running Fox, the one-eyed elder who had been most skeptical of her testimony. "Running Fox comes?" she asked Massacre quietly as she approached. "His choice," Massacre replied. "Says old eyes see the truth others miss. Good tracker before injury." Chief Grey Wolf appeared as they prepared to depart, his weathered face solemn in the early light. He spoke briefly to each warrior in Dakota, clasping their forearms in a gesture of respect and farewell. When he came to Elizabeth, he switched to English. "You carry the Dakota truth now," he said gravely. "Heavy burden for any shoulders, heavier for women alone between worlds." "I'm not alone," Elizabeth replied, glancing at Massacre and the others. Grey Wolf nodded, approval warming his dark eyes. "No, not alone." He pressed something into her hand, a small carved token bearing symbols she didn't recognize. "Show this to Calloway. He knows Grey Wolf's mark. Now we speak with a straight tongue." With these final words of guidance, the chief stepped back, raising his hand in a gesture of blessing or farewell, perhaps both. The small party mounted their horses, Elizabeth somewhat awkwardly, as she was still adapting to riding bareback in the Dakota fashion. As they rode away from the camp, Elizabeth glanced back once at the community that had sheltered her, however briefly. Women were dismantling lodges, children helping to pack belongings, elderly members directing the work with practiced authority. Despite the urgency of their evacuation, there was no panic, no chaos, just the efficient movement of a people accustomed to mobility and change. Their small party followed a narrow trail that wound through dense woodlands, moving at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting their mounts. The warriors remained vigilant, eyes constantly scanning the terrain, hands never far from weapons. Elizabeth rode beside Massacre, her body gradually adjusting to the rhythm of horseback travel. The Dakota had provided her with clothing better suited to the journey. Buckskin leggings beneath her dress, a fringed leather jacket, and a wide-brimmed, had traded from settlers that would shield her fair skin from the sun. "How far is it to Fort Laramie?" she asked as they forded a shallow stream. 7 days of good travel, Maka replied. Longer if we avoid main trails. Safer that way. Running Fox, riding ahead, called something back in Dakota. Maka tensed, his hand moving to his knife. What is it? Elizabeth asked, alarm rising. Fresh tracks crossing our path ahead, Maka translated. Shod horses, not Dakota. The group halted as Running Fox and Swift Elk dismounted to examine the trail. Their discussion was rapid and intense, punctuated by gestures toward the west and south. 6 riders, Maka explained quietly to Elizabeth. Passed this morning. Heavy horses, deep prints, army patrol maybe. Or Blackwood, Elizabeth finished, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. Stone Hand rejoined them, speaking urgently to Maka, who nodded grimly. Change of path, he told Elizabeth. Tracks head south toward the main trail. We go east first, then circle back. Adds 1 day to the journey, but safer. The extra day meant an additional day for Blackwood to prepare, to cover his tracks. Perhaps even to launch another raid that would be blamed on the Dakota. But self-preservation had to take precedence. They could deliver no justice if they didn't reach Fort Laramie alive. As they altered course, heading into denser woodland that would shield them from distant observers, Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on her shoulders. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness, a potential instrument of justice, perhaps even a bridge between 2 worlds locked in a cycle of suspicion and violence. The carved bear tucked safely in her pocket and Singing Bird's medicine. Bundle around her neck, Elizabeth Hargrove, once a banker's wife bound for Oregon, now something altogether different, rode deeper into a future she could never have imagined, toward a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but perhaps the fate of peace on this contested frontier. 6 days of hard riding had brought them to the outskirts of Fort Laramie territory. The journey had been arduous, crossing swollen rivers, navigating treacherous mountain passes, enduring a fierce thunderstorm that had forced them to shelter for nearly a full day in a narrow cave. They had encountered few people, a distant hunting party that Swift Elk identified as friendly Shoshone, a solitary trapper who averted his eyes and hurried past without engaging. Elizabeth's body had adapted to the rigors of extended travel, muscles hardening, reflexes quickening. She no longer required assistance mounting her horse, no longer winced at the prospect of another day in motion. The warriors, initially skeptical of her endurance, had gradually accepted her presence with something approaching respect. Even running. Box, who had watched her with suspicion throughout the early days of their journey, had softened slightly after Elizabeth used her knowledge of Whitefeather's medicinal herbs to treat a wound on his arm when it became infected. "We will camp here tonight," Maka announced as they reached a sheltered hollow beside a small creek. "Fort Laramie half-day's ride tomorrow." The group dismounted, falling into the practiced routine of making camp, securing the horses, gathering firewood, preparing a small meal of dried meat and wild roots gathered along the way. Elizabeth moved with the same efficiency as the warriors, her city-bred awkwardness long since discarded. As twilight descended, the 5 of them gathered around the small, nearly smokeless fire that Stone Hand had expertly constructed. The atmosphere was contemplative, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them at Fort Laramie. "What happens when we reach the fort?" Elizabeth asked, voicing the question that had preoccupied her throughout their journey. "Will they allow Dakota warriors to enter freely?" Maka exchanged glances with the others before answering. "Not altogether. Treaty allows individual Dakota to trade at fort. Stone Hand, known to Calloway, has traded there before. He goes first, with you, while we watch from the hills." It was a sensible precaution. A group of armed Dakota warriors approaching the fort might be met with hostility, especially given the tensions Blackwood had been fostering. And if Calloway isn't there, or doesn't believe us? The possibility had troubled Elizabeth's thoughts. More than once. Then we find another way, Massacre said simply, his calm certainty somehow reassuring. Truth finds a path like water finds a river. They settled into silence as night fully claimed the sky, stars emerging in brilliant profusion. Overhead, Elizabeth found her gaze drawn to Massacre's profile against the firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the quiet dignity in his bearing, the depths in his dark eyes that had seen too much suffering but remained unclouded by hatred. She had learned much about him during their journey, about his childhood in a world already changing under the pressure of white expansion, about his time at the mission school where he had learned English and glimpsed the complexities of the society encroaching on his people's land, about his return to Dakota ways with a foot in both worlds, neither fully belonging to either. In some ways, it mirrored her own current state of existence, caught between what she had been and what she was becoming. The woman who had left Philadelphia as Robert Hargrove's proper wife no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, more capable, more aware of both the brutality and beauty the world contained. "Should rest," Massacre said, interrupting her thoughts. "Tomorrow brings many challenges." Elizabeth nodded, retreating to the small shelter of branches the warriors had constructed. Sleep came more easily than she expected, her body's exhaustion overriding the anxiety in her mind. She woke to Running Fox's hand on her shoulder, the old warrior's one good eye alert with tension. "Riders coming," he whispered. "Many horses." Elizabeth scrambled to her feet, instantly awake. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Massacre and the others were already breaking camp, erasing signs of their presence with practiced efficiency. "Army patrol?" she asked, quickly gathering her few belongings. "No," Swift Elk replied grimly. "From the south, moving fast, not careful. Blackwood's men." A chill ran through Elizabeth despite the mild morning air. How had they been found? Had their trail been less carefully hidden than they believed? "How many?" she asked, strapping her. Packed to her horse with hands that remained steady despite her fear. 8, maybe 10, Stonehand answered. "Too many for direct flight." Massacre joined them, his expression grave. "Must reach the fort today. No time for the original plan." He turned to Elizabeth. "You and Stonehand ride ahead, fast as possible. Rest of us create false trails, lead them away." "No," Elizabeth objected immediately. "We stay together. I won't leave you to face them alone." The 4 warriors exchanged glances, something unspoken, passing between them. Finally, Running Fox spoke, his accented English rough but clear. "Women have a bare spirit now, should choose my own path." Massacre's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. Then we all rode to the fort, stay ahead of them as long as possible. They mounted quickly, spurring their horses to a gallop as the first rays of sunrise broke over the eastern hills. The terrain worked both for and against them. Rolling prairie that allowed for speed but offered little cover. Scattered corpses of trees that provided momentary concealment but slowed their progress. An hour into their desperate ride, Wolf Runner, who rode at the rear of their group, called out a warning. Elizabeth glanced back to see distant figures cresting a hill behind them, riders pushing their horses hard, closing the gap with each passing minute. "They've seen us," Massacre confirmed, grimly. "Fort still too far?" Stonehand pointed to a rocky outcropping ahead. "Defensible position. Make us stand there." It was their only option. The outcropping rose from the prairie like the spine of some ancient beast, offering natural cover and high ground. They urged their tired horses toward it, reaching the rocks. Just as the first shots rang out behind them, Elizabeth dismounted alongside the warriors, ducking behind a boulder as a bullet whined off the stone near her head. The pursuers had halted just beyond effective rifle range, clearly assessing the situation. "Blackwood," Massacre said, pointing to a tall figure at the center of the group. "The one with the silver hatband." Elizabeth peered carefully around her. Shelter, finally glimpsing the man who had orchestrated the massacre of her husband and friends. Even at this distance, there was something coldly calculating in his posture, in the way he gestured to his men as they spread out to surround the outcropping. 7 men with him, Swift Elk reported, his keen eyes counting their opponents. 2 with rifles, other pistols, 1 shotgun. We have higher ground, Stonehand observed, but they have us surrounded. Massacre checked his rifle, then the arrows, in his quiver. They want women alive, he said quietly to Elizabeth. Need to silence the witness, but the body at the fort would raise questions. The implications were clear. The warriors might be killed outright. But Elizabeth faced capture and a slower death once Blackwood had taken her far from witnesses. A voice called up from below, confident and coldly amused. "We know you're up." "There, Mom. No sense making this harder than it needs to be. Your Indian friends are dead either way, but you might live if you come down now." Elizabeth exchanged glances with Massacre, both recognizing the lie for what it was. "What are our options?" she asked, maintaining the calm she had learned from him during their days together. Before he could answer, the distant sound of a bugle cut through the morning air. All heads turned toward the east, where a dust cloud was rapidly approaching, a cavalry patrol from Fort Laramie, at least 20 riders strong. Blackwood and his men heard it too. Their formation broke immediately, the bandits wheeling their horses and spurring them toward the south, away from the approaching soldiers. "They run," Running Fox said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Not for long," Elizabeth replied, a sudden clarity filling her. She stood, ignoring Macca's warning gesture, and raised her rifle to her shoulder. The shot cracked across the prairie, the recoil familiar now against her shoulder. Nearly 400 yards away, Blackwood jerked in his saddle, then slumped forward. He clung to his horse for several more strides before sliding sideways to the ground. The other bandits scattered in panic, riding hard in different directions, abandoning their fallen leader. Elizabeth lowered the rifle slowly, a complex mixture of emotions washing through her, not triumph, not pleasure, but something more akin to completion. Justice, imperfect but real. "Good shot," Stonehand said quietly beside her. "Better than many warriors." The cavalry patrol drew nearer, clearly having witnessed both the bandits' flight and Elizabeth's shot. A new tension filled the group on the outcropping. Would the soldiers see 5 Dakota warriors and assume hostility? "Stay behind me," Elizabeth told the others, stepping forward to stand fully visible as the patrol approached. The captain reined in his horse at the base of the outcropping, hand raised to halt his men. His gaze took in the unusual group, a white woman in frontier dress standing protectively before 4 armed Dakota warriors. "Ma'am," he called up, confusion evident in his voice, "are you in need of assistance?" Elizabeth drew herself up to her full height. Chief Grey Wolf's token clutched in one hand, her rifle held non-threateningly in the other. "Captain, my name is Elizabeth Hargrove. I am the sole survivor of the Whitaker wagon train massacre. These men," she gestured to the warriors behind her, "have protected me and helped me reach Fort Laramie to testify to Indian Agent Calloway." The captain's expression shifted from confusion to alert interest. "The Whitaker train. We received reports. It was attacked by hostiles 3 weeks ago." "Those reports were false," Elizabeth stated firmly. "The man I just shot, Nathaniel Blackwood, led the attack with his gang of outlaws. They've been raiding both settler wagons and Dakota villages, deliberately inciting conflict between our peoples." Skepticism flickered across the captain's face, but he was professional enough not to dismiss her outright. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hargrove. One I can prove," she replied steadily. "With evidence, with testimony, and with the support of Chief Grey Wolf of the Dakota." She held up the carved token. "This is for Agent Calloway. The chief says he will recognize it as a sign of truth." To her surprise, the captain nodded slowly. "Calloway would. He's worked with Grey Wolf before. He studied the group for another moment before coming to a decision. You'll all come with us to the fort. The agent will want to hear this directly. As they descended from the outcropping to join the patrol, Elizabeth felt Macca's presence close behind her. You speak with strength now, he said quietly. Voice carries far. She glanced back at him, seeing approval in his dark eyes. I had a good teacher. The journey to Fort Laramie passed in a blur of explanations and introductions. The captain, James Hollister by name, proved more open-minded than many of his rank, listening to Elizabeth's abbreviated account with thoughtful attention. The fort itself appeared on the horizon by mid-morning, a sprawling complex of wooden buildings surrounded by a high palisade, the American flag fluttering above the central blockhouse. For most white settlers, it represented safety and civilization. In the wilderness, for the Dakota warriors, it symbolized the encroachment that threatened their way of life. For Elizabeth, it was neither sanctuary nor threat, but simply the next step in a journey that had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Indian agent Thomas Calloway received them in his office, a tall, lean man with a silver beard and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they presented with careful deliberation. He recognized Grey Wolf's token immediately, turning it over in his hands with evident respect. I've known the chief for 15 years, he told Elizabeth after hearing her full account. If he vouches for your story, that carries significant weight. The next hours were consumed with official statements, with questions about Blackwood's gang, with discussions of how to prevent further false attributions of violence. Runners were sent to retrieve Blackwood's body and to track down the scattered members of his gang. A report was drafted for the territorial governor, outlining the true circumstances of the Whitaker massacre and recommending a formal clearing of the Dakota of any involvement. Through it all, the four warriors remained present, but largely silent, observing the workings of white bureaucracy with inscrutable expressions. Macca occasionally translated a particularly complex exchange for the others, but otherwise stood as a steadfast presence at Elizabeth's side. As evening approached, Calloway leaned back in his chair, regarding Elizabeth with genuine admiration. You've done a remarkable thing, Mrs. Hargrove. Your testimony may prevent a wider conflict between settlers and the Dakota. It wasn't just me, Elizabeth replied, glancing at the warriors who had risked so much to bring her safely to this moment. Without them, without their people's willingness to listen when others wouldn't, I would never have survived to tell the truth. Calloway nodded thoughtfully. The question now is what comes next for you. We can arrange passage east with the next supply train. I imagine you have a family who would welcome you home after your ordeal. The question caught Elizabeth unprepared, though it should have been obvious. With her testimony given, with justice set in motion, the purpose that had driven her forward was fulfilled. Logic dictated a return to civilization, to the world she had known before. Yet as she glanced at Macca, at the other warriors who had become something like comrades during their shared journey, she realized that going back was impossible. Elizabeth Hargrove, who had left Philadelphia, no longer existed. Actually, she said slowly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke, I believe I'll be traveling north. Calloway's eyebrows rose. North? Yes. I've been invited to spend time with Dakota. She smiled slightly at the agent's surprised expression. I still have much to learn about their ways, and perhaps some things to teach as well. As understanding dawned in Calloway's eyes, Elizabeth felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The path ahead was neither simple nor safe, existing as it did in the difficult space between two worlds often at odds. But it was her path now, chosen freely, with full awareness of both its challenges and possibilities. Later, as they prepared to depart the fort with provisions supplied by a surprisingly supportive Calloway, Maka approached her privately. "Journey. North is long," he said, studying her face for any sign of doubt. "Life there is not easy for white woman." "I know," Elizabeth replied simply, "but it's where I belong now." Something shifted in Maka's expression, a softening, a recognition. "When Bear saved me from Bear," he said carefully, "started a new path. When you chose to stay with Dakota instead of soldiers, the path grew stronger." He touched the medicine bundle at her neck. "Now the path is clear." Elizabeth nodded, understanding what he couldn't quite express in English. Their lives had become intertwined through choices and circumstances, through shared dangers and mutual respect. What that meant for their future remained to be seen, but the direction was unmistakable. As they rode away from Fort Laramie, heading north toward Dakota territory, with the setting sun at their backs, Elizabeth felt the carved bear in her pocket, the talisman that had marked the beginning of her transformation. She was neither fully of the world she had left, nor entirely of the one she was entering, but perhaps that in-between space was exactly where she needed to be. The lone survivor of a tragedy had become something more, a bridge between peoples, a voice for truth, a woman who had found strength she never knew she possessed. And as the prairie stretched endlessly before them, Elizabeth Hargrove rode toward her future with clear eyes and an open heart, ready for whatever awaited her on the horizon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.